The Hague
Kia
Initiative
ora,
for
talofa
International
lava.
A
Cooperation.
very important
In almost every language
the Israel
other than
Institute of New
English
Zealand.
and
My
French.
roots come from Jerusalem.
So, good evening. My name is Ashley Church, and I'm a co-director of the Israel Report. And this is yet another episode of our long-running program, the Israel Report, which, as some of you will know, was on Shine TV for quite some period of time. We've now brought it to you virtually on Zoom, and this is the second of what we hope will be an ongoing series of episodes running every fortnight. Tonight, absolutely delighted that I'm joined again by Dr. David Kerman, who's a regular on the Israel Report, and also this evening for the first time, Dr. Cherie Trotter, who hasn't graced us with her presence in the past, but we're looking forward to her particular contribution tonight, given her background and her understanding of the issues that we'll be discussing. So tonight we're going to be discussing the position and opinion of Billy Takei, who some of you will know is the leader of the Advanced New Zealand Party. And so Billy's gained quite a profile in that party, which is and has quite some support around the country. And you know, kudos to anybody who's put themselves forward to be involved in the political scene, who's prepared to actually put themselves on the line and in terms of offering themselves to represent the country. But we have some concerns in particular about some of the views that Billy has taken with regard to, in particular, Zionism, but also to the state of Israel. And so we're going to talk tonight and maybe unpack some of that and just talk about some of the claims that he's making versus the reality of what's actually going on. And so before I do that, though, I'd just like to introduce Cherie Trotter. And Cherie, as I mentioned before, is an academic. So Dr. Cherie Trotter, 4 years investigating primary source and secondary source material on Zionism, supervised by 2 senior academics and reviewed by international scholars. And bearing in mind that Billy's setting himself up as something of an expert on this topic, it's actually very appropriate tonight that we would have Dr. Trotter actually speaking to this topic and perhaps bringing some academic balance to it so that we've got a bit more perspective. So welcome, Cherie, and looking forward to hearing from you this evening.
Thanks, Ashley, and kia ora koutou.
And fantastic, Cherie. And so in a couple of minutes, I'm actually going to ask you to start to unpack some of that material. But just before I do that, just want to also acknowledge Dr. David Kerman. So we'll start with you, David.
Sure. So the last episode of this was focused on the political parties' positions towards Israel. We've decided to turn to individuals and devote an entire episode to Billy TK of the Alliance Party now as co-leader because of a 1 hour and 20-minute post that he put up on Facebook in which he based a lot of his discussion on falsehoods and falsehoods that lead to demonization of Jews, that misrepresent Zionism and Israel entirely and are quite dangerous. And that's why we've taken a whole episode to discuss it, because it hasn't been discussed in many places in depth at all. A lot of his other conspiracy theories have been debunked in the media a little bit, but this one hasn't. And so we felt it important to break it down a little bit, to show you what he was saying, to show you where he might have got it from and how he might have got it. And the reason that it's so dangerous is because we've seen this throughout history. Whenever Jews are demonized, it often leads to worse things than just that.
So I just want to start by saying that I know Billy, that my Piri and I have been involved with Billy in the past through music, and we really like him, and I consider him a friend. But this is about some of Billy's views concerning Israel, the Jews, and Zionism, and it's based on a video that he did on Facebook, a Facebook live video that he put out on the 4th of June and also on the 5th of June. And so that's what we want to look at today, because we believe that some of these ideas are really quite dangerous and that they're ill-founded. And we're just going to start by hearing a little clip from that talk from the 4th of June.
People like Sir Conan Doyle were a part of it. It was all these very high-level hobnobs that were a part of it, and they were driven by the devil. They were satanic, and it was under the guise of these Freemasons and all these people that did these types of things that the Balfour Declaration came about. But this is where Freemasonry kicks in. If you have a pen handy, write this name down: General Albert Pike. General Albert Pike and Mazzini. Write down Mazzini and Google this letter, General Albert Pike letter to Mazzini. And when you examine that letter written by General Albert Pike, the Scottish Rite High Freemason in the United States in the 19th century, he wrote a strategy for 3 key wars and Zionism, and the First World War was to be started with a revolution in Russia to end Orthodox end the Tsar rule, which is the royal rule of Russia, and also counter the Orthodox Church. But it was also to help facilitate the need for Zionism. Let's go to World War II. His next plan was to create a war between through socialism. And in this plan, it would end up where there would be a communistic state set up in Russia, again, the Russia that was defeated in the 1915 Soviets and communist revolution, and it would cause a friction between the Soviet East and the capitalist West. And we know that happened, that's history, but it would also create pain in Europe for the Jewish citizenry. Keep that in mind. Now, in this plan, there was a plan for a third world war, and this plan would would involve the Islamic world rubbed up against the Judeo-Christian world into a religious war between the Islamic East and the Judeo-Christian West.
So that gives you a little bit of a taste, and if you're like me and you're listening to this telling of history, what you're noticing, even with a little bit of knowledge of history, is the gaps, the lack of connection between one piece of information and another piece of information. So I listened to it, I struggled to make sense of it, and try to figure out, where's he getting at, what's he getting at here. So I followed what he recommended, and I Googled this guy. He emphasized it, General Albert Pike and Mazzini. So I Googled that, and when you Google it, there was a letter. You will find this letter supposedly between General Albert Pike and Mazzini. And Ashley, perhaps you could bring up one part of that letter. Absolutely. So this letter was apparently written in 1871, and what it lays out is okay. So this is right. So this letter lays out.
Sorry, for some reason sorry, Cherie.
It's all right. I'll wait for Ashley I'll carry on while Ashley's looking for it, explain it. So this is a part of the letter, but what this supposed letter lays out is a kind of a blueprint of history, and it's supposedly a plan, a Freemason plan, because this guy, General Albert Pike, and Mazzini, who's this Italian leader, they're Freemasons. And so this is a Freemason plan, which is really about, it's an agenda to establish pursue these wars, these World War I, World War II, World War III, and it's all part of bringing in a kind of a new world order. It's kind of a takeover. That's my paraphrase of it very briefly. But if we have a look at what it says about World War II here, for example, I'll give you a minute to have a look at that. So Second World War must be fomented by taking advantages of the differences between the fascists and political Zionists. This war must be brought about, hang on, I can't quite see it all, must be brought about so that Nazism is destroyed and that political Zionism be strong enough to institute a sovereign state of Israel and Palestine. Well, we don't really need to read any further because this was written in 1871. So,
Sharia, just interrupting you, it just occurs to me reading that, it sort of shades of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It's that sort of nonsense.
Yeah, it is. It is. But I mean, I think you will all notice that some of this terminology, Nazism, Zionism, communism, in 1871, these things weren't around, right? I mean, some of the leaders might have been there and some of the ideas might have been there in incipient form, but this is kind of, well, it's anachronistic, right? So, so this letter has World War I, World War II, World War III. And the problem is that there is no letter. Like, there's no evidence that this letter actually exists. So you go to the websites, you will find this these 3 world wars, but you won't find an actual letter. So when you start to dig, and I did a bit of digging this week about this letter, and the closest I can come to it is that the idea seems to have originated in the 1950s. And I mean, you do your research and see if you can find something out. But 1950s, a guy called William James Carr, he was known as a conspiracy theorist. He was accused of being an anti-Semite. He later turned to writing about a vast conspiracy which he alleged to have uncovered. He was described as the most influential source in creating the American Illuminati demonology. So what we have here is this whole theory which is built on a fabricated source. So as a historian, you know what the process of history is, right? It's that you look at the original sources, you look at the primary source material. So for example, I've spent the last 4 years examining Zionism. I have looked at hundreds of documents, of letters, of journal writings, of bulletins. And so what the historian does is examines the documents, interrogates them for, how accurate they are. You try and verify them. You read the history around it. You read the way history has changed over time regarding those documents. What we have here is a whole theory based on no evidence. So here is Billy saying, do your history, guys. I'm a critical thinker. Do your history. This is not how you do history, okay? So I went a bit further, Googled this Albert Pike, not Albert Mike and Pacini, it's the other way around, Albert Pike and Mazzini. And so we come to a website, it's got the letter, and it's also got the kind of thinking around it. It's got what conspiracy theorists do with this letter, the kind of narrative they weave around it. And we're going to show you some of the images from this website, and I'm going to hand it over to David to kind of speak to some of these images. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Sheree. Ashley will bring up the images. I think Ashley's comment about this having shades of the protocols of the Elders of Zion is really important. I think that the idea that there are lies being spread that implicate Jews in, being behind wars and controlling politics and having all these nefarious things going on is extremely dangerous. And we've seen it throughout history where these sorts of demonizations have been used to incite pogroms, and we've seen Jews being demonized leading up to the Holocaust. And the modern form of the oldest hate, as it's known, anti-Semitism, is to rather than talk about Jew, because it's not so politically correct, to talk about Israel or Zionists. Yeah. And when you follow this thread, as Sheree did, researching not only the fact that it's fabricated and there is no real letter, obviously, for anyone who's really thinking about this, but then it's also used for really demonizing Jews even more. And so these are some images that were on one of the sites that popped up when you do start to Google General Albert Pike, and when you do start to go down that rabbit hole, it ends up, or it continues rather, into things like this, where the US-based Illuminati Jewish neocons, excuse me, that's a mouthful, are anxious to increase tensions and provoke war with Russia. Their ultimate goal is to unseat Putin. And what I find interesting about this is two things, other than that obvious, to anyone that's right-thinking, obvious demonization conspiracy theory. But the first thing is they say no proof is necessary, which is rather convenient. And secondly, there is an image, as you see in the bottom left of that corner, of a right-wing meme known as the Greedy Merchant or the Happy Merchant, which is obviously a Jewish caricature. You can see all the features. There's a Star of David in the background, and it says Jewish straight up front in the top. So this is clear modern day anti-Semitism that is no different to the olden anti-Semitism. Ashley. There's also once in deep debt to the Zionist Jew-run IMF, the International Monetary Fund. Russia is now growing a prosperous state. So it's not only the Jews that are behind the Illuminati, it's also the Jews that are now running apparently the IMF. just Zionist Jew-run IMF. It's not even trying to get rid of the word Jew to make it even slightly more PC. Next, Ashley, is the bankers can't have it both ways. And of course, tying Jews to banking is a classic anti-Semitic trope. And there is no question where these statements are trying to get at. It's not just bankers, of course. They've all got stars of David on their heads. So there is very little attempt to try and hide the anti-Semitism that is in here. They can destroy a belief system that tried to elevate humanity in the image of God, but they won't like the world they created any more than we do. So these evil Jewish bankers are trying to take down the world. Quite vile.
And Bill Gates and the Queen.
Of course, the link. Sorry, Ashley?
And Bill Gates and the Queen, just to finish the group off. So.
That's right. And people might have heard of David Icke, who unfortunately made a lot of money out of selling these sorts of lies to people, that Bill Gates and the Queen, for example, were shape-shifting lizards from another planet. I mean, this type of stuff comes from what I hope we all think is true craziness. But the real danger in this is that there are people that are on the bandwagon. There are people that believe this, even to a little degree. And the worry that I have in particular is that people might act on this. And so all these lies that are made about Israel, about Zionists, are really lies about Jews that might have real world consequences. And when you start to go down the rabbit hole of the internet, particularly in a social media age, you end up looking at this sort of stuff and you might believe it. And then you have a charismatic person like Billy TK who can sell it. And he did an 1:20 live stream video that's been seen by more than 5,000 people spewing this kind of stuff. It's really, really, really concerning. David Farrer, in fact, did an excellent blog post, which we'll link to in a bit. And it showed how Billy TK moved from March this year saying the government needs to lock down to protect us from coronavirus to a very short period of time, a few months later, he was then saying the New World Order is trying to keep us locked up. And in that space of time, Billy said that he had done his research. And by that, he had followed the rabbit hole. And this is the sort of place where it ends up. And this is why we think it's important to show what he says, to explore it a little bit, and to show people where it's all going.
So just picking up from there, I just want to answer a couple of these questions here from Angel.
Angel Matagi.
Okay. Angel. So I just want to say, Angel, that I did reach out to Billy after he did that video. Yeah, okay, Angel, I'm answering now. You don't have to shout. I am in the middle of a presentation and I'm not bagging him. Again, we're looking at his views, all right? So you need to separate this from Billy and what he's propagating. If he's standing up as a leader and he's telling people, go and Google this, then, you know, we have to speak up. No, we're not bagging him. So I did reach out to Billy after he did a Zoom and asked if we could talk, and he fobbed me off, basically. He didn't engage. So I did tag Billy in my post, so he should be aware that this is happening. But I would ask you to show this to Billy, share it with him. I'm happy to sit down and talk with Billy. He is a friend. So,
Shuri, there's also a question here or a point made a couple of times by somebody essentially inferring that these are Billy's personal views and not his political views, and therefore they're not relevant. And from my perspective, that's a PERC distinction, because at the end of the day, who we are personally, if we're putting ourselves into the political arena, essentially informs who we would become as politicians and how we would act in that role. So I think that distinction, trying to force a distinction to say, because these are Billy's personal views, although he may hold them, they don't necessarily impact who he is as a politician, is a false one. Yeah,
and I think there's another thing, well, there's a couple of things at play. First, this video has been on his Facebook page until this week. Today I heard that it's not there anymore, but a few days ago, I went and had a look for it. It was there. So I think he's taken it down, aware that this was coming. So if it's on his Facebook page for everybody to see, then he has a responsibility as a public figure for what he puts out there. But the other point to make is that he has said over and over again that he's a critical thinker. he tells people to do the research. He's actually quite arrogant in the way he puts this across as well, do the history, and he bags people. And so what we're trying to show here, I think, is important, because we're showing that his research is not solid, and that's a really important point. But I want to move on because we've got some important points to make. So one of the dangers here is that the way that he is demonizing Zionists and Zionism. So there was a survey last year of the New Zealand Jewish community, and 80% of Aucklanders identify with Zionism, Auckland Jews, shall I say, the Auckland Jewish community. 60% of the Wellington Jewish community identify with Zionism. The survey, the definition of Zionism was being connected to the Jewish people, culture and beliefs, Hebrew language, Jewish homeland. 90% of the people, Jewish people in the survey, felt a sense of responsibility for Israel when it's in danger. So the danger here is that he is creating this, he's demonizing Zionists. Who are Zionists? They are simply mostly Jewish people. I mean, there are non-Jewish people who identify as Zionists as well. But, you know, when you can see the danger there, can't you? That it's Jewish people at the end of the day that he's bagging, that he's demonizing. And in the wrong hands, this is dangerous, because we've seen it. I mean, Jewish history is replete with examples of people acting on bad information, bad ideas, and the dehumanization of Jewish people. So this is why it's dangerous and it's anti-Semitic. And this is why we feel that we need to really speak to this issue. Anything to add to that, David?
No, I think I just reiterate what you said about this being one of his conspiracy theories that we're talking about, but actually some of the other things that Billy TK is spreading in his very charismatic way and his very self-assured way are also not based on entirely solid foundations. And I go back to what I said before. I think David Farrar really showed quite nicely how Billy went down a rabbit hole of social media, in particular, YouTube videos and the like. And there's a lot of research that's been done on this. We know that false information and fake news travels 6 times faster than truth on social media. And those algorithms that the social media companies have are tweaked and designed to keep you looking. And one of the best ways to do that is to continually show you more and more of these sorts of conspiracy theories. And that's why, for example, Holocaust denial features quite heavily on these platforms. It's why anti-Semitic posts are so common, and why there's a lot of discussion around whether or not and how to regulate, etc. So I think the consequences of what we're talking about here in this particular case of this video that he posted that particularly demonizes Jews and Zionism and undermines Israel's right to exist is part of something slightly bigger. The other point that I'll make before I hand it back is, you know, this isn't a criticism of Israel. I know that a lot of people who come up with these sorts of conspiracy theories like to say, I'm not against Jews. I love Jews. I just hate Zionists and I hate Israel. And I think it's racist, and it was founded on the documents of Satan worshippers, as Billy has implied. That is not criticism of Israel. If you're criticizing a nation state like any other nation state, you'll do so in terms like you would any other country. But Billy's not doing that. No other government is held to that sort of a standard by undermining some of the legitimate foundations of Israel. So I think for those reasons, it's important that we make this video. I'd love for Billy to watch it. I'd love to have a discussion with him. But as Cherie said, he didn't want to. As was written on that poster, there's no proof necessary.
No, David, there's one small counterpoint to that, though. There's a question that's just come in from Catherine, and she's saying, I think that Labor changing laws during the night, bringing in full-term abortion with no select committee oversight is every bit as serious, probably worse. Look, in some respects, I personally, I'm not speaking for anybody else in the Institute, I probably agree with that in the sense that she means it. But the Israel Institute's role is to talk about issues that impact on in respect of New Zealand's relationship and its view of Israel and of Jewish people in general. And so it's absolutely appropriate, Catherine, that the Israel Institute, as a body which has tasked itself with that role, would actually take on this particular topic and deal with it. So while I don't necessarily disagree with the point that you've made in the context of what we do as an organisation, this is a totally appropriate topic for us to cover.
Yeah, and I'll also pick up on Catherine's other point. It's great, by the way, that there are people who seem to really want to defend Billy here and have the discussion. I think that's fantastic, and it's great that we can have it. David Farrier is the fake news king, she writes. I don't trust him at all. I have a bit of sympathy for that as well, and all that I would say is, without reading anything that David Farrier wrote, just look at the screenshots that he took of Billy's social media posts. And I think that says it enough. Billy has said it in his own words. He went from the government needs to shut down the borders and lock us down to protect us from COVID in March, and a couple of months later he was saying the New World Order is trying to keep us subjugated. So unfortunately, we're using Billy's words here, not anyone else's.
Yeah. So where we want to go from here is we want to just kind of draw a little bit of picture of what Zionism actually was, and we can only do this very briefly, but we feel it's important to round it up that way, and then we'll deal with any other questions that might come along. Just going back to Billy's narrative, so he paints this picture of the Rothschilds and Balfour as these very evil entities. They're Freemasons, right? So who were the Rothschilds? And with regard to Zionism, there are two main Rothschilds. There was one, Edmund Rothschild, who was a philanthropist, and he contributed money towards building up colonies in the 19th century. Now, these colonies weren't very successful in actual fact, and Herzl actually opposed Rothschild. He opposed the work that he was doing, the philanthropic approach. And there's another point to make here, is that the Zionist movement was not a monolithic, all-powerful, wealthy movement. In fact, it was multifarious. There were many different branches, many different factions of Zionists. You had practical Zionists, political Zionists, social Zionists, cultural Zionists, different kinds of religious Zionists. You had territorialists. There were many different factions, and they all argued and fought and debated. And in fact, when Herzl died, people say he died of a broken heart, because the last Zionist Congress before he died was so contentious, because there was a huge walkout of the Russian contingent who didn't support the British plan for Uganda, right? Now, that's just an example to show what the Zionist movement actually was like. It's not anything like this fabricated picture of Zionism being this. It was a people's movement, is another thing. It was ordinary people, a lot of poor people. It was driven by the persecution of Jews in the 19th century, coming from Europe, East Europe, coming from Russia. Millions of Jews left Russia in the 19th century after the 1880s, where there were pogroms and persecutions. Millions went to America. Some came to New Zealand, but this was the push to return to their ancient homeland. But you've got to remember that in the 19th century, it was the first time that the opportunity was there. And why was that? That was because in the 1830s, Egypt got control of that part of the Ottoman Empire, and they opened the way for foreigners to be able to come into the land. And so you had European powers getting a foothold in Palestine over this period. You had Russia, you had Germany, you had Britain, you had France. They went in, they built churches, they started colonies. It wasn't just the Jews returning to Palestine in the 19th century, because it was the Christian Holy Land, right? So this is all part of the context behind Zionism, the Zionist movement. It was a competitive thing, and the 19th century was just hard yakka for the Jews who tried to return. I mean, it was a primitive land, it was hard work, many gave up, they went home, many died. I mean, malaria was a big thing, it was a swamp-ridden land, right? So this whole idea that he is portraying of Rothschild, Balfour. Who was Balfour? Okay, Balfour was a British politician. He was the foreign minister at the time that that agreement was signed. And what was the Balfour Declaration? It was simply a letter that stated the British intent their support for a Jewish homeland. It wasn't a Jewish state at that time because they knew that a Jewish state would not get signed off. Look, I could talk for ages, and we probably are running out of time, but I guess the points I've made so far, and I could go on and make more points, and I might just make one or two more points if you don't mind.
Rika, just before you do
is
that, can I just cut in and say, for me, the takeaway from what you've just said is the very dramatic contrast between the very disparate and fractured nature of the Zionist movement in the late 19th and even early 20th century versus this picture that's painted by these conspiracists that it was this sort of global movement that was spearheaded by capitalists and very, very wealthy Jewish folk who were looking to take over the world. It couldn't be more different, but the reality from this image that's been created.
Yeah, if I could jump in there, I think to add to that, Ashley and Cherie, one of the things that Billy said in his talk was, in fact, when you study your history, study on it, only 1% of the 300,000 odd British Jews supported Zionism. Again, that couldn't be further from the truth. And it was actually the elite, wealthy Jews in Britain on the whole who didn't want to upset the apple cart, who didn't want to try and create waves in society. And it was the much larger percentage of not as wealthy Jews who really saw the idea of the re-establishment of a homeland as an aspiration and a way to be saved, basically, get out. So again, taking it back to what Billy says and the distinction between his research and reality, I think needs to be underscored.
Sure, and I just following up on that, you're absolutely right. You know, the Zionist movement in Britain, he talks about the British Zionists being opposed to it, the anti-Zionists. As David has said, there was, in the establishment, there was an anti-Zionist movement because they were worried about the issue of dual loyalty. And this was a big deal for Jews because they were often accused of not being loyal to their state. And so that was the driver there. But it was the poor Jews, especially those who had come from Eastern Europe, from Russia, who understood the danger, that were the ones who really supported. It was a people's movement, in fact. And actually, it was actually global, but it wasn't a powerful global movement. It was global in the sense of ordinary people, ordinary Jewish people around the world supporting their fellow Jews. So in New Zealand, for example, there were Zionist societies in New Zealand, and they did a lot of work of fundraising, and it was really a humanitarian movement. You know, the driver was the persecution of Jews, which happened right throughout, from the 19th century, the early 20th century, through World War I. The Holocaust was really just the culmination of this long period of persecution. And so in New Zealand, for example, the New Zealand Jewish women, they established Plunkett-style infant welfare centres in Palestine for Arabs and Jews, and it really helped the mortality rate of the babies over there. And so this is what the Zionist movement was actually like. Look, I want to tell you that I had the chance to go to the Central Zionist archives in Jerusalem during my research, and I read through lots and lots of letters from the Central Zionist Organisation to the New Zealand Zionist societies. And what do you think the content of the letter was? It was about the need for fundraising, because the Zionist movement was cash strapped most of the time. They didn't have funds. And this is why the rest of the Jewish world came on board. And, you know, your older Jewish people, Leslie will know, she's listing some of the others, they had blue boxes in their houses, and they would put pennies every week in the blue box. And that was for Israel, or Palestine under the Mandate, later Israel. So this is how Zionism worked. It was a people's movement, it was a humanitarian movement, and you've got to remember that under the British Mandate, it was under British control. So you had the Zionist organisation in Palestine, but they were very constrained because they were in, the British had to balance the Jewish community, the Arab community, and increasingly the British powers there made it more and more difficult for the Jewish people. And this was while Nazi Germany was also increasing the pressure on the Jews and persecution. And so we had Jewish people trying to get out of Europe. We had countries like New Zealand not being very generous about taking Jewish people in. And we had the British and Palestine also bringing on the brakes for Jews getting there. So you can see there was this huge cauldron happening.
And next edition, in a fortnight, we'll look at some of the other individuals on the political scene in New Zealand from more mainstream parties, some of the outstanding MPs that have done wonderful things for Israel, and some of the MPs who are less than desirable, shall we say. So we'll have a little bit of a discussion about a broader range of people in the next edition. I hope you'll join us.
And just thanks, David. And just before I just get Cherie to say some closing words, is just a message here from Marion saying to have a good understanding of Jewish history, the book From Time Immemorial by Joan Peters is the best book. And it brought tears to Marion's eyes. I don't know that book, Marion, but thank you for recommending that and putting it forward. And Cherie, just before I ask you the same question, can I first just say you've been a fantastic addition to this episode. I'm looking forward to, don't know why we didn't do it sooner. Looking forward to having you on lots more going forward, and thank you very much for the I guess the historical perspective that you brought to us this evening.
Thanks, Ashley. Yeah, well, I think David summed it up really well, and all I really want to say is, especially to Billy's supporters here, that I really like Billy, and I actually really care about Billy as well, and I hope that he will hear this and think about it and maybe take on board some of what we've been saying. And I'd really love to sit down, the invitation is still there that I put out to him in June, to sit down and have a talk about these things.
Fantastic. So thank you, Cherie and David. As always, we will be back again in a fortnight, and we'll be focusing on a broader group of individuals and talking about those who are on both sides of the issue of Israel in Parliament, and also aspiring to be in Parliament, and what they bring to the political debate and conversation. So thank you again for your time this evening, and we'll look forward to seeing you all again in a fortnight's time. Good evening.
The Hague Initiative for International
A
Cooperation.
very important
Almost every language
Israel
other than
Institute of New Zealand.
French
My roots come from Jerusalem.